Fascism. What is it and why is it? Fascism arose between the two world wars, 1918 to 1945, and was mainly a reaction against liberalism and modernity. The fascists felt there was too much freedom given to the common people in the form of democracy. They believed this led to a weakening of the state and a loss of national pride and identity. There are many strands of fascism, but we will be dealing with the two main strands: German National Socialism, later called Nazism, and Italian Fascio, meaning union or league. From this point forward, we will call German fascism Nazism and Italian fascism fascism. In this session, we will look at the reasons fascism arose, what it was rising against, the practical results of a country under fascist rule, and question if it could happen again. We will explore the nature of fascism compared to liberalism and modernity, and show how fascism was primarily a reaction against these two ideals. Fascism has been defined in varied ways, but as an ideology, fascism can be described as a totalitarian political system led by a dictator that aggressively pursues nationalism, militarism, and racism. This ideology arose at a time of enormous political upheaval and general unrest, that is, the ending of the First World War. Fascist founder Mussolini came into power as head and creator of the Fascist Party in 1922. An interesting point about Mussolini: he was an ardent socialist before the 1920s and advocated pacifistic ideals. The new ideology he ended up championing, however, is against these ideals. Fascism is an intensely war-driven, pro-state, nationalistic ideology. Seton Watson suggests Mussolini's break from pacifist socialism and consequent creation of fascism was an act of rebellion. He says, once neutrality had been proclaimed by the government, it became respectable and there was little joy left in preaching it. Basically, Mussolini liked to ride the extremes of the political spectrum. Post-World War I, Italy was paying the price of peace. Thousands dead and 500,000 permanently disabled, social and economic exhaustion, ruined foreign trade, and rampant inflation. Being a relatively newly formed nation, the country was in its infancy and ripe for a strong leader to champion the national Italian ideal. A leader to fuse Italy into a cohesive, culturally separate nation. The ultra-violent aspect of fascism also appealed to the displaced ex-servicemen, who had an intense dislike for the capitalist workers who seemed to profit during and after the war, while they, the servicemen, suffered. Mussolini and his party used these feelings of unrest to stir up support for fascism. As he said in a speech given in May 1918, "We who have survived, we who are returning, demand the right to govern Italy." Both Mussolini and Hitler espoused the necessity of war and violence to achieve their aims of dominance. In Mussolini's doctrine of fascism, he states, "For fascism, the tendency to empire, that is to say, to the expansion of nations, is a manifestation of vitality. Its opposite, staying at home, is a sign of decadence." Hitler shows his tendency towards violence in his autobiography, Mein Kampf. Hitler discusses the violent nature of the Social Democrats and how he believes it is best to respond to them with equal violence. In another section, he observes that the masses are happier being oppressed than with freedom, that is, liberalism. In perhaps the clearest representation of Hitler's skewed survival of the fittest mentality, he says, "Those who want to live, let them fight, and those who do not want to fight in this world of eternal struggle do not deserve to live." Fascism is an anti-rational ideology and is based on action rather than words. It is in direct opposition to the liberal ideals of rational thought. The fascists use the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's works as a basis for their anti-rational stance. In his readings, Nietzsche impresses the idea of the will to power as the prime motivator of humans. He discounts the liberal notion of understanding through reason and says of desires and passions, "Thinking is only the relationship of these drives to one another." This means thinking is merely the link, not the reason. To him, will is the sole reason and motivation of people. The reader can also find other indicators of classical fascist thinking in Nietzsche's work. For example, Nietzsche states that there are superior human beings who will always rise to the top, but they need to keep in contact with the common man to acquire greater knowledge. A rather good example of the thinking of a fascist can be nicely summed up by one last quote from Nietzsche. Our supreme insights must and should sound like follies, in certain cases like crimes, when they come impermissibly to the ears of those who are not predisposed and predestined for them. Fascism is also anti-individualistic. Whereas liberalism celebrates the individual and individual rights, fascism denounces the individual in favour of the state. As Mussolini himself says, the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. And the fascist state interprets, develops and potentiates the whole life of a people. To Mussolini, the individual is nothing, the state is everything. To a liberal, it is the exact opposite. The liberal sees the state as a mechanism of the people, there to serve them and nothing else, with each individual being equal. To the fascist, the people are there to serve the state and only matter in that context. As Haywood puts it, this cohesion of people and state is what gave fascism popular appeal at times of crisis, dislocation and disorder. Within this cohesion, however, people are not equal, but rather, as alluded to in Nietzsche's words, there is an elite class and a common class. Unlike in liberalism, there is no social contract between these two groups. To the fascist, it is natural that there is an inequality in society, but this idea of inequality and natural hierarchy has been taken further and extended to encompass nations as well. This idea means some nations are naturally destined to rule others. Nazism takes this idea even further and applies it to the whole races as well. This thinking justified the Nazi attempt at exterminating the Jews. Adolf Hitler was influenced by Mussolini's ideas and consequently held him in great respect. Hitler took Mussolini's fascist ideas and added racism, creating Nazism. Rising to power in Germany in 1933 as Chancellor, one of the first things Hitler's party did was introduce eugenics laws. Heavily influenced by social Darwinism, Hitler believed totally in the idea of survival of the fittest. The Nazi doctrine, while still embracing basic fascist ideas of statehood, anti-individualism and elitism, taught that racially inferior people were draining the Nordic or Aryan people of their supposed power. Hitler's approach to fascism was violent, certainly, but he also wanted to resurrect the past glories of Germany, even if this meant tampering with history slightly and romanticising it. In his pursuit of this aim, Hitler employed the talents of Wagner, a German composer, to write and perform classic Germanic tales through the opera. This also caused resurgence in Germany's folk tales. Mussolini took a similar approach, resurrecting Italy's empirical past and excavating old Roman buildings. The idea behind this anti-modernistic outlook was to instill in both the Germanic and Italian people a sense of identity, a sense of past glory, and to inspire them to future splendour and unequivocal rule. The practical results of fascism in Germany and Italy were slightly different due to their differing views in certain areas. The main area of difference is the idea of eugenics. However, both countries have obvious similarities. Both parties were elected democratically. Both then seized power and forced a dictatorship on the country. Both turned their respective countries into police states, and they both used propaganda with amazing efficiency. Controlling the newly emerging mass communications was a boon to the dictators in their spread of propaganda. Only party-approved releases were allowed, and new techniques were utilised to bring the party ideal to the masses. In all, the two dictators had a massive stranglehold on all forms of communication, which allowed them to control what the public saw and ultimately thought. According to Dennis Mack Smith, teachers in Italian universities and schools, editors and trade unions had to swear loyalty to fascist regime before they were allowed to practice their professions. At the height of fascism, a citizen could not work or travel without a party card, and in Germany, and eventually Italy as well, people of Jewish descent were not entitled to one. In all reality, all areas of private life were taken over by the state and run by the dictator of that country. This total loss of individual freedom is directly against liberal ideas. Some scholars believe fascism was only possible in the World War era, as a direct response to the post-World War I environment. However, as it is primarily a reaction to liberalism and modernity, it is highly possible that this insidious, violent and intolerant ideology could rise again. In Iraq, for example, there are obvious similarities in the method of dictatorship of now dead Saddam Hussein and Hitler and Mussolini. The fascist method of rule was to set up an infallible leader who was in direct contact with the people and was their self-professed protector. The fascists also felt it was their destiny to conquer the entire world, starting with their neighbours. Saddam followed this blueprint almost exactly. He set himself up as the one true leader of Iraq with opulent mansions and multiple statues of himself to remind the masses. He constantly led takeover wars into Iran and Kuwait and oppressed the Kurdish people. He was just as ruthless to his own people, killing, exiling or torturing any who opposed him, in the tradition of a perfect fascist regime. So in conclusion, it can be seen that fascism, whether German Nazism or Italian fascism, is a direct response to liberalism and modernity. The height of fascism occurred during the period of the two world wars and was perhaps strongest at this time due to post-war social insecurities and the novelty of the ideology. That is, no one knew what could and would be the result of such an extreme dictatorial regime. It was possibly strongest in Italy and Germany due to their common past of recent formation as full nations and the need to create a cohesive national identity. The other factor could be the lack of reintegration into society of the returning World War I servicemen. These servicemen were probably scarred, hostile, violent and isolated. Fascism, with its massively violent slant, would have appealed to this large group. In Germany, the Nazi obsession with eugenics and the natural perceived elitism of the Aryan race would have appealed to the public as well, who were also trying to find their own national identity. The results of fascism in practice, even after being elected democratically, were not surprising. Both strands pushed out any dissenting voices through the use of extreme violence and absolute control of mass media and communications, making opposition impossible. Both fascist countries overreached themselves in their pursuit of world domination and were defeated by the Allies in World War II. However, it has also been seen that fascist ideas are still present after this time. This is because fascism was not tied to a particular era, and because it is a response to liberalism and modernity, it will and does continue to exist.